Welcome back to Chapter Chats. Today we're jumping into Chapter 8 of Chuck Hodell's 5th edition of ISD from the Ground Up, a no-nonsense approach to instructional design. This chapter is all about implementation, the most visible piece of the ISD puzzle. We'll talk about what goes on into making implementation plans effective and how to design both short and long form guides, and why Gagne's 9 events of instruction still matters in today's learning environments. So let's get into it. Chuck, my first question for you is, you describe implementation as the only part of ISD that learners actually see. Why do you think it often gets less attention from designers than analysis or the design process part?
It's an interesting question. And as you look through the chapter, you're going to see a lot of very technical things, which may surprise some readers that aren't as familiar with ISD and learning design as others. Because we think about implementation before we learn about instructional design, and we think that's the one thing that we do. We all implement, we teach, facilitate, we do whatever. And until we really learn what's going on, we don't have a good feel for the depth of what implementation is really about, especially from the design perspective. And there's also some folks that think implementation doesn't need to be evaluated or it doesn't need to be thought about after you actually do it. There's all kinds of things going on in this chapter. But I think for the most part, this is some pretty technical stuff, and it really gets into cognitive science and the other parts of the science of instructional design that we hit on a lot in this.
Yeah. You talk about the difference between short form and long form implementation plans. When is it appropriate to use each, and what are the risks of not providing enough detail?
Yeah, I think the risks are your entire lesson goes off the rails and down the side of the hill into a river. Because if you're not teaching it, and even if you are, sometimes things don't go the way you think they are supposed to. So what happens when you put together a learning plan, whether you call it an instructor's guide, lesson plan, what have you, the notion is that you need to have some roadmap for how you're going to get from the beginning of that lesson to the end. So how are you going to gain attention? And in the end, how are you going to evaluate? How are you going to know if learners reach mastery? And in a lot of implementation, there is none of that. And many times there's no evaluation. The number of courses actually get level 2s. It's not what you think it is. It's 30, 40% at best. So when you look at implementation, you think, okay, this is a lot more complex than I thought it was. And I need to really be on my game to be able to put together a plan that not only could I potentially teach, but I could hand off to 10, 15, 100, 200 other people and feel some level of confidence that this could be implemented.
Your version of Gagne's 9 events of instruction breaks things into prepare, present, practice, and evaluate. What inspired this structure, and how do you see it helping new gen designers?
Well, when Robert Gagne put this together, he was thinking about how do people learn? How do people take an experience and move it to short-term memory and then hopefully to long-term memory, which is what we're really aiming to do at this point. So sometimes this is muscle memory, sometimes it's other things. But the whole notion is there's a process to learning. There's a process to remembering. And without getting the cognitive science part of it, which frankly I'm not qualified to go too deep into it, the notion here is that you start off by gaining attention. You tell them what you're going to do. You go through recall. You present new content, 3 levels of interaction and feedback. Then you do evaluation and closure. And there are your 9 events. I renamed several of these, but with Dr. Gagne's approval. I didn't just go out and freelance on this. He actually approved my version of the wording on these. So if any of you are looking at this and thinking I was just out freelance, I guess not what I was doing. So he actually approved this. And the notion was I was trying to modernize it a bit and change some of it so it was more practical in terms of what designers look at and think about. So as we think about long-term, short-term, however you want to think about memory, and then you think about long-form and short-form in terms of how you're going to put together some kind of an implementation guide, you really have to think about who are your facilitators. Are they able to do this without a lot of assistance? Another thing that goes into this is level of detail. because I've had many clients and organizations that wanted the 9 events, and they wanted everything that was going to be said by a facilitator to be in this lesson plan, sometimes word for word. So it just depends on how detailed your information is, what are the requirements for the course, for the client, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a lot going into this matrix of implementation.
It does sound like it. You mentioned the 3D and even 4D implementation models with options like synchronous, asynchronous, and blended across multiple variables. Do you think designers are overcomplicating things, or is this level of choice necessary today?
Yeah, I think it's probably not adequate. I think there's probably more choices. I don't remember how many different options I came up with, 90 something. I don't recall at this point. But the notion is, don't be afraid to step out of the classroom and the teacher in the front. If you're a designer, how much of your work is actually that? How much is micro lessons? How much is other things that are more informal? So when we look at implementation, we have to get out of the old legacy approach of one person in front of a group of learners. Yes, we still do that. It still takes place, still done very well. But there are now a whole new age of things that we need to think about as designers. And there may be a better way to do it that takes half the time and is actually more efficient in terms of getting information into the learners into long-term memory, which is where we want this stuff to go eventually.
Last question. One section that stood out was mistakes to avoid for each of the 9 events. What is one common mistake that you see designers make during implementation, and how would you coach them to fix it?
I think the biggest mistake that I see from a professional side is they don't evaluate. You haven't set up your lesson to be evaluated. You haven't done and written objectives that can be evaluated. So it goes back to performance agreement and the other things we talk about here in the podcast and also in the books, is this notion of, to be a professional designer, you have to not only set the roadmap for where you want learners to be, but you have to have a way to figure out whether they got there or not and to what degree of proficiency they've gotten there. So can they do it? Can they do it well? Can they do it without error? Those kind of things are very important. And many times it's much easier as a facilitator, and let's be honest, Denise, you and I both teach and facilitate. Sometimes it's very easy just to get up there and say what you got to say and leave. There's times when I really like to do that, but the designer in me says, if this is a serious course where people really need to be able to take this information and do something with it, then I got to step up my game. I got to do the 9 events in one way or another. And the other thing you find out, learners never know you do the 9 events. They have no concept of this. They're just sitting there taking it all in. And sometimes the biggest mistake is to think that you can go easy on this, that you can cut out some of these important elements of this and still hope to be successful at what you do. And perhaps you will be, but I'm willing to guess that most of the time it's not going to be as good as it could be.
Yeah, the temptation is there, like you said, to skip some of those portions, but I don't know. I find I love the structure of using something like Gagne's 9 events because I feel like it keeps me tuned in to how adults learn, and I get to check all those boxes. It makes me feel better as a designer, developer, and a facilitator.
One of the best parts of teaching new instructors is to go through the 9 events. And then as you're presenting the lesson on the 9 events, point out to them what event they're in as you're teaching it. And you should see the lights go off in their heads. It's like, I didn't realize that's what you were doing. What do you mean you're gaining attention? Oh, what? We practiced this 3 times? And so I think that's a hoot. And if you ever teach other instructors how to be good instructors, which I'm sure many of you will or are doing already, it's that moment where you just see a light go off and they go, oh, yeah, he's doing it, and he didn't even tell us. Yeah, I always enjoy that part of it.
Thanks so much, Chuck, for sharing your insights, and thanks everyone for tuning in to this chapter chat. Join us for the next one. Thanks.